Today, we're going back to the early 2000s, to a time of pirating songs off LimeWire, messaging your friends on AIM, and playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Most importantly, however, Peter Jackson had just finished his masterpiece trilogy with Return of the King. The extended edition box set was my favorite present that Christmas, and I was immediately drawn to the majestic architecture of Minas Tirith, the White City of Gondor. When I heard that Laki from Zorpazorp was setting out to make the biggest and most ambitious miniature version of the Gondorian capital, I jumped at the opportunity to join the project. So I slid into his DMs like Smeagol into a damp cave and waited.
My precious.
Naturally, I missed his call since he's on kangaroo time, but let's listen to his voicemail and see if we can make sense of the basic requirements.
Knarby, let's talk Minas Tirith, dude. So building-wise, I'm thinking something that's like really important to the people of Gondor, an essential kind of part of the fabric of city life, maybe like a community hall or a brothel or a library or a brothel or maybe even something like military, like a barracks or a brothel. Basically just let your mind run wild, mate. Go for whatever building that really inspires you. I cannot wait to see it.
Well, alright, we're in. I think I'll have to come up with something more family-friendly. How about the Minas Tirith Archives? It was here that Gandalf the Grey spent hours poring over the dusty tomes, searching for any clue that might shed light on the mystery of the One Ring and the true nature of its maker, the Dark Lord Sauron. For the architectural style, you'll notice that Minas Tirith uses a ton of Roman arches and features from antiquity. These features are somewhat blended with medieval fantasy into something that looks quite anachronistic. Using this aesthetic, I took to Blender to model out a rough concept and give myself a good blueprint to work from. From here, I exported some of the drawings and assets as vector images, and cut them up on my 50-watt desktop laser from GYK Cloud. This thing's been a beast at speeding up my miniature builds. I'll admit, I went a bit crazy here. Not all of these parts are going to end up being used, but I wanted to make a good selection to rummage through and inspire myself. I'm putting together the main box shape, so I have a starting point to work from. The idea is to have wide open interiors to this building where we can nestle in some ancient books and scrolls for Gandalf to discover. I used some scraps of cardboard for the floor, but don't worry, we'll be covering this all up with XPS foam later. See, this corrugation here gets a nice cladding with these little trim pieces. And speaking of XPS foam, I need to do a little bit of upgrading to my hot wire table for this project. As I was cutting the profiles for the building, I also designed, modeled, and cut out a new taller fence for my hot wire table. It's going to be running along some aluminum extrusion profiles mounted to the sides here. This new fence lets me rip larger pieces of XPS foam much cleaner. I'm also able to match the shape of some of the arches I've cut with this hot wire table, and even just using the soldering iron in some places. Here I'm inscribing some flagstone textures with a pencil, followed by a roll with some crinkled up aluminum foil. I go back and forth between this technique and just using the soldering iron for the grooves. As I layer bits of XPS foam on top of each other, it creates this really interesting layered effect. It was at this point that I realized I'd never be able to properly paint inside some of these rooms, so I got some black gesso and acrylic paint to prime them now. It won't stick out if it's just a dark recess. To make the interiors more interesting, I cut out some blocks to divide up the area, hinting at internal stairwells and other rooms that are not visible. These all got inscribed with the Minas Tirith style stonework I learned from the Zorpster himself. I press and indent various stones to get them to look distinct and interesting. A few paper drinking straws make up the column details here, which gives me the idea to pivot this building into being a barbershop. I'm also adding in some laser engraved trim friezes. If we're going Roman inspired, we might as well borrow that too, right? We're also adding this little side building here to make this project more complex than it already is. I'm making a groove for it to slot into and just carving away the foam with my soldering iron. I then do a simple stone texture to clad this structure in. For the roof, I have some leftover shingles from my Rapunzel tower build, and this is a great chance to use them up. Now let's work on the very top of the roof next. From the inspiration footage and in my 3D plans, I wanted the top to have this imposing cupola, which I want to have detachable for shipping. I framed the roof segment with chipboard, lining it with this pattern that I shamelessly stole from Weta Workshop's rendition of these buildings. Since I had already sketched and modeled most of the cupola section from scratch in my concept phase, I decided to just hit print, as many of you tease in the comments. I gotta say, that looks quite nicely perched on top. Time to work on the back section, which I wanted a little bit of a roof slope and be able to cover up all the internal support structures we made earlier. This gets the same roof treatment, using up the rest of my shingle supply. To add some further visual interest, I added these buttresses to the back and gave them the same stone block appearance as the rest of the wall. Now how about we add some more details? I got some windows and doors that I can countersink into the XPS foam. These are printed in PLA as opposed to resin, as it saves me the trouble of post-processing them, and they print quite quickly flat on the print bed. I even printed out some Romanesque statues so that Lockie could live out whatever fantasies he's planning for this wargaming board. With all those details in place, it was time to trick my camera's exposure settings by covering everything in a black matte gesso. I'm adding a bit of plaster mix to this to get that textured stone effect over everything, unifying it together through stippling. Taking this outside, I prime it in another black coat first, and then a dusting of off-white for all the stonework and other features. Since the building will be mostly made up of white stone, this saves me a lot of time when I take it back inside for detailing. I do pick out some stones in blue to give it some visual interest, and give everything a black oil wash to define the contrast a bit more. From here, it was just a matter of dry brushing. I added some browns for dirt and grime effects, and it was time to add the finishing details to this thing. This was a blast to build, and hopefully it survives shipping all the way to Australia. Please go check out all the other videos linked below. If you don't have time for all of them, go and watch Kit Bash Box's video in particular, as Dave designed and sculpted all his own models for this rendition of the Adventurers Guild. Huge thanks to my patrons for all their support, and I'll see you next time.